The morning mist clung to the valley floor like gossamer dreams as 17-year-old Clara May guided the orphaned calf back toward the Henderson ranch. Her gentle voice humming a lullaby her grandmother had taught her while she cradled the silver locket that held her parents' faded portraits, the only inheritance from the fever that had claimed them both last winter. This made 37 calves she'd found wandering lost in the past 6 months, each one reunited with its frantic mother through Clara's patient tracking and inexplicable ability to understand the language of distressed cattle, a gift that had earned her whispered speculation from the valley's superstitious ranchers about whether she possessed some mystical connection to the animals. The Henderson place sprawled before her like a promise of prosperity, its whitewashed fences and red barns speaking of success that felt as distant as the stars to a girl who'd been sleeping in haylofts and trading her tracking services for occasional meals since becoming an orphan. She'd never seen the ranch's owner, Jack Henderson, though every rancher in 3 counties spoke his name with the kind of respect reserved for men who'd built something lasting from nothing but grit and determination. And as Clara approached the main corral with the bleating calf trotting obediently beside her, she wondered if this mysterious cowboy would be like all the others, grateful for her help, but quick to send her on her way before she could become an inconvenience. The silver locket bounced against her chest with each step, its familiar weight reminding her of her mother's final words. "Clara May, your gift with animals is God's way of making sure you'll never go hungry. Use it wisely, and it will lead you home." The ranch house came into view as she crested a small rise, and Clara caught her breath at the sight of the most magnificent man she'd ever seen. Tall as a pine tree with shoulders broad enough to carry the world's troubles, sandy hair that caught the morning light like spun gold, and hands gentle enough to calm a spooked horse, while strong enough to wrestle a bull to the ground. He was kneeling beside a pen filled with the calves Clara had returned over the past months, methodically counting each one while making notes in a leather-bound ledger, his brow furrowed with concentration that spoke of a mind sharp enough to build an empire from dust and dreams. When he looked up and saw Clara approaching with the latest lost calf, his face broke into a smile that transformed his rugged features from handsome to absolutely devastating. And Clara felt the silver locket skip against her rapidly beating heart as she realized that this cowboy, this magnificent, impossible man, had been keeping track of every single animal she'd brought home. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack Henderson said, his voice carrying the warm rumble of summer thunder as he stood to his full imposing height. "If it isn't the valley's guardian angel bringing me number 38. And Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized he'd been counting not just the calves, but her acts of kindness, as if each lost animal she'd returned was a gift specifically meant for him. Jack Henderson's storm-blue eyes held a warmth that made Clara's knees weak as he approached with long, confident strides, his presence filling the morning air with an energy that made her silver locket seem to pulse against her chest like a second heartbeat. "Name's Jack," he said, extending a work-calloused hand that engulfed Clara's smaller one with surprising gentleness, while his gaze took in her worn dress, her too thin frame, and the proud lift of her chin that spoke of someone who'd learned to survive on determination, alone. "And you must be the mysterious young woman who's been saving my livestock and disappearing before I could properly thank you." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized he'd been trying to find her. Wanting to express gratitude, she'd been too shy and too aware of her lowly status to receive, while the calf she'd brought wandered into the pen to rejoin its anxious mother with a reunion that brought tears to her eyes. "I'm Clara May Whitfield," she said softly, her fingers unconsciously touching the silver locket. "And I don't need thanks. Seeing families reunited is payment enough." But Jack's expression grew thoughtful as he studied her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing straight through to her soul. Behind them, the ranch bustled with the organized chaos of successful enterprise. Cowhands moving cattle, horses being groomed, and the sound of hammers ringing from a new barn under construction. But Clara felt as if she and Jack existed in a bubble of perfect stillness, where only they mattered. 38 calves, Jack mused aloud, consulting his ledger again, each one found and returned by a girl who asks for nothing in return. Clara May, do you have any idea what you've saved me in lost livestock? She shook her head, genuinely puzzled by the question, because in her mind she'd simply been doing what any decent person would do when they found something that didn't belong to them. But Jack's next words made her silver locket feel suddenly heavy against her chest. Those calves represent nearly $2,000 in future beef sales, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. Which means you've single-handedly prevented me from facing financial ruin, and you did it without expecting so much as a thank you. Clara's world tilted sideways as she processed the magnitude of what he was telling her, understanding for the first time that her simple acts of kindness had had consequences far beyond reuniting worried cattle families, and when Jack stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intimate rumble, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Clara May, he said, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face with fingers that trembled slightly. I've been looking for you for months, not just to thank you, but to ask you something important. Would you consider staying here, not as hired help, but as... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. While Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, and the silver locket burned like a brand against her skin, the morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the ranch that made everything look touched by magic. While Clara waited for Jack Henderson to finish the sentence that might change her life forever, her mind reeling with the impossible possibility that the most successful rancher in 3 counties might be about to offer her something more precious than all his cattle combined. The words that Clara had been holding her breath to hear were interrupted by the thunder of approaching hooves as 5 riders crested the hill behind them, their faces grim with purpose, and their leader, a silver-haired man with cold eyes and an expensive suit, surveying Jack's ranch with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property for purchase. Jack's entire demeanor shifted, his relaxed warmth replaced by steel-edged tension as he stepped protectively in front of Clara, his hand instinctively moving to the gun belt slung low on his hips, while she felt the silver locket grow cold against her chest as if sensing the approaching storm. Nathaniel Barrow, Jack said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled hostility usually reserved for rattlesnakes and claim jumpers, while Clara's blood chilled as she recognized the name. Every rancher in the territory knew Barrow as the ruthless cattle baron who'd been systematically buying out smaller spreads, sometimes through legal means and sometimes through methods that left families fleeing in the night. The silver-haired man dismounted with theatrical grace, his 4 companions remaining mounted and watchful like guards protecting a king, while his thin lips curved into a smile that held all the warmth of a winter grave as he said, Jack Henderson. Looking prosperous as always. It's amazing how well a man can do when he doesn't lose livestock to predators and rustlers like the rest of us. Clara felt Jack tense beside her, as Barrow's implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The suggestion that Jack's success came from something other than honest hard work, while her mind raced to understand the undercurrents of this confrontation that seemed to involve more than simple neighborly visits. My cattle stay safe because I hire good men and build strong fences, Jack replied evenly. But Clara could hear the warning beneath his controlled tone. Perhaps if you spent less time scheming and more time ranching, you'd have similar success. Barrow's laugh was like ice breaking on a frozen pond as he gestured toward the pen full of reunited calves, his voice dripping with false concern as he said, Speaking of cattle, I've been hearing interesting stories about mysterious losses throughout the valley. Seems like livestock has been disappearing from various ranches, only to turn up here on your spread, Jack." Clara's world tilted sideways as she realized what Barrow was implying. The accusation hitting her like a physical blow as she understood that her acts of kindness were being twisted into evidence of theft, while Jack's protective stance grew even more pronounced as he stepped further in front of her. "Those calves were returned by Miss Whitfield here," Jack said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never backed down from a fight. "She's been tracking lost livestock throughout the valley and reuniting them with their proper owners, including several that belonged to you, if memory serves." Barrow's cold gaze fixed on Clara for the first time, studying her with the intensity of a hawk evaluating prey. While she felt exposed and vulnerable under his scrutiny, the silver locket feeling like it weighed 100 pounds against her chest as she realized she'd somehow become the center of a conflict she didn't understand. "How convenient," Barrow mused, his tone suggesting anything but convenience. "A mysterious girl appears in the valley just as cattle start going missing, and somehow they all end up benefiting Jack Henderson's ranch. One might almost think it was planned. The morning sun, that had seemed so golden, moments before now felt harsh and unforgiving, as Clara understood that her gift for finding lost animals, the blessing her mother had promised would lead her home, might instead lead her to a noose if Barrow convinced enough people that she was a rustler working in partnership with Jack Henderson. The confrontation that had been building like a summer thunderstorm finally broke, when Jack stepped forward, his imposing frame radiating barely controlled fury as he said, "Nathaniel, if you're accusing Clara May of cattle rustling, you'd better have proof stronger than your jealous suspicions, because I won't stand here and let you slander an innocent girl who's done nothing but help her neighbors." Clara felt the silver locket burn against her chest as she watched these two powerful men face off over her honor, her heart swelling with gratitude that Jack would defend her, even though he'd only just learned her full name, while Barrow's thin smile suggested he'd been hoping to provoke exactly this kind of reaction. "Innocent?" Barrow repeated, his voice dripping with manufactured shock. "Jack, this girl has been wandering the valley for months with no visible means of support, somehow always knowing exactly where to find valuable livestock that mysteriously strays from its home range. If that's innocence, then I'm the territorial governor." Clara's cheeks burned with shame as she realized how her circumstances must look to suspicious minds. A homeless orphan with an unusual gift that could easily be explained by less charitable theories. While Jack's jaw tightened with protective anger that made her feel both cherished and terrified. "Clara May has a gift with animals," Jack said firmly, his storm blue eyes never leaving Barrow's face. "She can track them in ways that seem impossible to men like us, but that doesn't make her a thief. It makes her special." The word special hung in the air between them like a benediction, and Clara felt tears threaten as she realized this magnificent man was willing to stake his reputation on her character, despite having known her for less than an hour, while Barrow's expression suggested he'd found the weakness he'd been looking for. "Special enough to always know which cattle to steal and which ranches to target?" Barrow pressed, his voice taking on the persuasive tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Special enough to earn the protection of the valley's most successful rancher, who just happens to benefit from every animal she rescues?" Clara watched in horror as doubt flickered across the faces of Jack's cowhands, who had gathered to watch the confrontation, understanding that Barrow's poisonous suggestions were taking root in minds already suspicious of anything they couldn't easily explain, while the silver locket felt like it was burning a hole through her chest. "That's enough," Jack said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble that made even Barrow's mounted guards shift nervously in their saddles. "Clara May, get behind me. This conversation is over." But Clara surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping forward instead of back, her hand closing around the silver locket as she drew strength from her parents' memory and said, "Mr. Barrow, if you think I'm a cattle thief, then prove it." But don't you dare suggest that Mr. Henderson is anything less than the most honorable man in this territory." The words rang across the ranch yard like a church bell, carrying a conviction that made several of Jack's cowhands nod approvingly, while Jack's expression transformed from protective anger to something approaching wonder as he stared at the slip of a girl who was willing to face down the most dangerous man in the territory to defend his honor. Barrow's cold smile widened as he said, "Very well, Miss Whitfield. I'll prove it. And when I do, both you and your protector will learn what happens to thieves in my territory." Before mounting his horse and riding away with his men, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the promise of approaching storm clouds. 3 days after Barrow's threatening visit, Clara sat in Jack's kitchen sharing breakfast with the man who'd insisted she stay at the ranch where he could protect her, watching morning sunlight stream through gingham curtains, while her heart hammered with nervous excitement every time their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the coffee pot. Jack had been nothing but a perfect gentleman, giving her the guest room and treating her with a respectful courtesy that somehow made her long for something less proper. While the silver locket rested warm against her chest, reminding her of her mother's wisdom about recognizing home when she found it. "Clara May," Jack said suddenly, setting down his coffee cup with the careful precision of a man wrestling with important words. "There's something I need to tell you before Barrow makes good on his threats. Something about why he's so determined to destroy me." She looked up from her eggs to find his storm-blue eyes filled with a vulnerability that transformed his rugged features from imposing to heartbreaking, and she realized that whatever he was about to reveal would change everything between them, for better or worse. "5 years ago," Jack continued, his voice heavy with old pain, "I was engaged to Barrow's daughter, Elizabeth. She was beautiful, refined, everything a successful rancher thought he wanted in a wife, but she was also shallow, cruel, and completely under her father's control." Clara's heart clenched with unexpected jealousy as she imagined Jack with another woman, but she forced herself to listen as he explained how Elizabeth had used their engagement as a weapon, demanding expensive gifts and social privileges while showing nothing but contempt for his modest ranch and simple lifestyle. "The final straw came when I found her beating one of my horses with a riding crop because it had stepped in a puddle and splashed mud on her dress," Jack said, his hands clenching into fists at the memory. "When I confronted her, she laughed and said animals were property, meant to serve their betters without complaint. That's when I knew I could never marry someone who saw living creatures as mere objects." Clara felt the silver locket pulse against her chest as she understood that Jack's love for animals, the same love that had drawn him to appreciate her gift, had cost him his first chance at marriage and made him an enemy of the territory's most powerful man. "Elizabeth was furious when I broke our engagement," Jack continued, "but Barrow was absolutely livid. He'd been counting on merging our properties through marriage, and when that plan fell through, he vowed to destroy me through whatever means necessary." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock, as Clara processed the magnitude of what Jack had revealed, understanding that her presence at his ranch had given Barrow the perfect weapon to use against the man who dared to reject his daughter and his schemes. "Jack," Clara said softly, reaching across the table to touch his clenched fist with fingers that trembled slightly. "You should have told me sooner. If I'd known my being here would put you in danger, I would have left immediately." But Jack's hand turned palm up beneath hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that felt like a lifeline, as he said, "Clara May, don't you understand? Finding you, watching you care for those lost calves with such gentle patience, seeing your pure heart and generous spirit, it made me realize what I'd been looking for all along wasn't a refined lady who could pour tea and arrange flowers, but a woman with the courage to wade through mud and brambles to save a frightened animal." The silver locket seemed to glow with warmth as Clara stared into Jack's eyes and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Not just gratitude or admiration, but the deep, abiding love she'd been afraid to hope for, shining like sunlight through storm clouds. "I love you, Clara May," Jack whispered, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "And I don't care if Barrow burns down my ranch and runs me out of the territory. I won't let him hurt you, and I won't let him destroy what we've found together." Clara's heart soared like a meadowlark at Jack's declaration of love, but before she could respond with the words that had been building in her chest like floodwaters behind a dam, the sound of galloping horses shattered the morning peace as Barrow returned with twice as many men and the territorial sheriff in tow. Jack's face went granite hard as he stood and moved to the window, his body positioned protectively between Clara and the approaching threat, while she felt the silver locket grow cold against her skin, as if sensing the danger that rode toward them like a pack of wolves, scenting blood. "Stay behind me," Jack commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But Clara's stubborn streak, the same determination that had driven her to track lost calves through dangerous terrain, made her stand beside him instead, her chin lifted with defiant courage that would have made her parents proud. Sheriff Morrison dismounted with the reluctant air of a man being forced to perform distasteful duties, his weathered face creased with lines that spoke of too many years mediating disputes between powerful men who used the law as a weapon rather than a shield, while Barrow's satisfaction radiated from him like heat from a forge. "Jack Henderson," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with official authority. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Clara May Whitfield on charges of cattle rustling, and I need to search your property for evidence of stolen livestock." Clara felt the world tilt sideways as the reality of her situation crashed over her like an avalanche, understanding that Barrow had somehow manufactured evidence or bribed witnesses to support his accusations, while Jack's protective instincts blazed to life with frightening intensity. "Sheriff," Jack said, stepping onto the porch with Clara close behind him, "you've known me for 10 years. Have I ever given you reason to doubt my honesty or integrity?" Morrison's uncomfortable expression suggested he was caught between his respect for Jack and pressure from forces beyond his control, while Barrow dismounted with theatrical precision, his cold smile suggesting he held cards that would win this hand, regardless of truth or justice. "Integrity doesn't enter into it," Barrow said smoothly, producing a document from his coat with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick. "I have signed statements from 3 ranchers confirming that Miss Whitfield was seen on their property immediately before valuable cattle went missing, and I have witnesses who saw her driving those same animals toward your ranch under cover of darkness." Clara's knees nearly buckled as she realized the scope of Barrow's conspiracy, understanding that he'd spent weeks or months building a case against her using half-truths, manufactured witnesses, and the kind of legal maneuvering that made innocent people look guilty to those who wanted to believe the worst. "That's impossible," Jack said, his voice carrying the ring of absolute certainty. "Clara May has been here every night for the past week, and before that, she was returning lost animals during daylight hours when anyone could see her. Your witnesses are either lying or mistaken." The sheriff's uncomfortable shifting suggested he recognized the weakness of the evidence, but felt powerless to ignore the political pressure being applied by the territory's most influential cattle baron. While Clara felt the silver locket burning against her chest, like a brand, as she realized that her gift, her mother's promised blessing, had become the very thing that might destroy her. "I'm sorry, Jack," Sheriff Morrison said, genuine regret in his voice, "but I have to take Miss Whitfield into custody pending a formal hearing. The territorial judge will be here next week, and she can present her defense then." Clara watched in horror as the sheriff approached with manacles that would bind her hands and mark her as a criminal in the eyes of everyone who saw her, while Jack's fury built like a volcano preparing to erupt, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun belt in a gesture that would solve nothing and doom them both. Time slowed to honey-thick crawls as Clara watched Jack's hand hover over his gun, seeing in his storm-blue eyes the desperate calculation of a man weighing the cost of violence against the certainty of losing everything he'd just found worth fighting for, while the silver locket against her chest seemed to pulse with her parents' voices, reminding her that sometimes the greatest courage comes from surrendering rather than fighting. "Jack, no," Clara said quietly, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled but held steady purpose. "Violence won't solve this. It will only give them an excuse to destroy you too, and then who will protect your ranch and your men?" The sheriff paused in his approach, clearly hoping to avoid bloodshed. While Barrow's cold smile suggested he would welcome any excuse to see Jack Henderson buried alongside his reputation, and Clara realized that her next words would determine whether love triumphed or perished in the dust of a ranch yard showdown. "I'll go willingly, Sheriff Morrison," Clara announced, stepping away from Jack's protective embrace, despite every instinct screaming at her to hide behind his strength. "But I want everyone here to witness that I'm innocent of these charges, and that when the truth comes out, Nathaniel Barrow will be exposed as the liar and schemer he's always been." Jack's anguished, "Clara May, no," tore through her heart like a blade, but she forced herself to walk toward the sheriff with her head held high, the silver locket bouncing against her chest in rhythm with her pounding heart as she extended her wrists for the cold bite of iron manacles. "This isn't over," Jack said, his voice carrying the promise of a man who would move mountains to protect what he loved, while Barrow's triumphant expression suggested he believed he'd already won the war that mattered most, the destruction of Jack Henderson's happiness and prosperity. As the sheriff helped Clara onto his horse, treating her with more gentleness than the situation required, she looked back at Jack standing on his porch like a monument to barely restrained fury and whispered, "Count the calves, Jack. Count them all, and remember that love always finds a way home." The ride to town passed in a blur of dust and despair as Clara clutched the silver locket and tried to make sense of how her gift for finding lost things had led her to find the love of her life, only to lose her freedom in the same breath. While behind them, Jack's ranch grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it her only taste of happiness in a world that seemed determined to punish kindness. At the jail, Sheriff Morrison locked her in a cell barely large enough for a grown man, his weathered face creased with genuine regret as he said, "Miss Whitfield, I hope you can prove your innocence when the judge arrives, because hanging a girl your age for cattle rustling would leave a stain on this territory that won't wash clean." Clara sat on the narrow cot and watched sunset paint the cell walls orange and gold. Her fingers wrapped around the silver locket as she whispered prayers her parents had taught her and tried to believe that somehow, some way, Jack Henderson would find a way to prove her innocence before Barrow's lies became her death sentence. Outside her barred window, the town settled into evening routines that seemed to belong to another world entirely, while inside her heart, Clara held tight to the memory of Jack's voice saying, "I love you," and the promise that love always finds a way home, even when the path leads through darkness deeper than any valley shadow. The fourth day of Clara's imprisonment brought unexpected visitors as Jack arrived at the jail with an armload of documents and a determined expression that made Sheriff Morrison step back involuntarily, while Clara's heart leaped at the sight of the man who'd been haunting her dreams with memories of storm-blue eyes and gentle hands. "Sheriff," Jack announced, spreading papers across Morrison's desk with the precision of a general deploying troops, "I've spent the past 3 days riding to every ranch in the territory, documenting every calf that Clara May returned, and I think you'll find the evidence rather illuminating." Clara pressed her face against the cell bars, the silver locket cool against her chest as she watched Jack present his case with the methodical thoroughness of a man who'd built a successful ranch through attention to detail, while Sheriff Morrison examined the documents with growing amazement. "According to these bills of sale and brand registrations," Jack continued, Every single animal that Clara May returned was worth significantly less than $100, hardly the kind of valuable livestock that professional rustlers would target when there are prize bulls and breeding stock available for the taking. Clara felt hope kindle in her chest, like a carefully tended flame, as she understood Jack's strategy. Watching him demonstrate that her supposed crimes made no financial sense for someone engaged in systematic cattle theft, while Sheriff Morrison's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Furthermore," Jack said, producing another set of papers, "I've documented that Clara May returned animals to 17 different ranchers over 6 months, including several who are now claiming she stole from them. If she was really working with me to build my herd, why would she give away cattle to my competitors?" The logic was unassailable, and Clara saw doubt creep into Sheriff Morrison's weathered features as he realized the absurdity of the charges against her. While outside, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of several ranchers who'd apparently come at Jack's invitation. Tom Bradley from the Circle B Ranch entered first, his hat in his hands and his face flushed with embarrassment as he said, "Sheriff, I need to retract my statement about Miss Whitfield. After Jack showed me the dates and times, I realized I was confused about when my cattle went missing, and it wasn't when I saw her on my property at all." One by one, the other accusers filtered in, each admitting to similar confusion or coercion, until only Barrow's paid witnesses remained to support the rustling charges, while Clara's silver locket seemed to grow warmer with each retraction. "There's something else," Jack said, his voice taking on the hard edge that appeared when he was truly angry. "I did some investigating into Barrow's business practices, and I discovered some interesting patterns in his recent cattle purchases. Seems he's been buying stolen livestock from real rustlers operating out of Mexico, then using forged papers to legitimize the sales." Sheriff Morrison's face darkened as Jack presented evidence of Barrow's actual crimes, while Clara realized that her wrongful imprisonment had inadvertently exposed the very corruption that Barrow had tried to pin on her, the truth emerging like sunrise after the darkest night. "Sheriff Morrison?" A new voice called from the doorway, and Clara's heart sank as Nathaniel Barrow entered with his usual theatrical confidence, though she noticed something desperate lurking behind his cold smile. "I hope you're not letting this criminal's accomplice fill your head with lies and fabricated evidence." But Jack's smile was razor-sharp as he said, "Actually, Nathaniel, I think the sheriff is beginning to understand exactly who the real criminal is in this situation, while producing one final document that made Barrow's face go pale as winter snow. This is a bill of sale showing that you purchased 50 head of cattle from known rustlers just last month," Jack announced. "Cattle that were stolen from ranches in New Mexico and driven across the territorial border under cover of darkness, which makes you not just a receiver of stolen goods, but an accessory to cattle rustling on a scale that makes Clara May's supposed crimes look like a child's prank." The jail fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and Barrow's increasingly labored breathing, while Clara felt the silver locket pulse against her chest like a heartbeat, as she realized that Jack had not only proven her innocence, but exposed the true villain in a web of corruption that had been festering in the territory for years. The confrontation that had been building since Clara's first day in the valley reached its climax as Sheriff Morrison stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt, while his weathered face hardened with the righteous anger of a lawman who'd been played for a fool by men who thought themselves above justice. "Nathaniel Barrow," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, cattle rustling, and filing false charges against an innocent citizen." While Barrow's desperate eyes darted toward the door like a trapped animal seeking escape. Clara's heart hammered against the silver locket as she watched the most powerful man in the territory face the consequences of his crimes, while Jack stood beside the sheriff's desk with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd fought for truth and seen it triumph over corruption and lies. "This is ridiculous," Barrow sputtered. but his usual commanding presence had crumbled into pathetic bluster as the evidence mounted against him. "You can't possibly believe the word of a saddle tramp and his pet rustler over a respected businessman like myself." The sheriff's laugh held no humor as he produced manacles that had been meant for Clara's wrists, saying, "Respected businessman? Nathaniel, after what I've seen today, I wouldn't trust you to sell me water in the desert." While Jack stepped forward with papers that would seal Barrow's fate. "There's more, Sheriff," Jack said, his storm blue eyes fixed on Barrow with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. "I found records showing that Barrow has been systematically bankrupting small ranchers by stealing their cattle and then offering to buy their land at reduced prices. He's not just a rustler. He's been using theft to build his empire." Clara pressed her face against the cell bars, hardly daring to breathe as she watched justice finally catch up with the man who'd tried to destroy her and Jack. While outside, the sound of more horses suggested that word of Barrow's arrest was spreading through town like wildfire. "The territorial marshal is riding in from Denver," Sheriff Morrison announced as he locked the manacles around Barrow's wrists. "And I suspect he'll be very interested in your business practices, especially the connections to those Mexican rustlers who've been plaguing ranchers on both sides of the border." Barrow's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. His cold mask finally slipping to reveal the vicious, petty man beneath as he snarled, "This isn't over, Henderson. Even if you've won this battle, I'll find a way to destroy you and your precious pet." But Jack's smile was calm and confident as he said, "Nathaniel, the only thing you'll be destroying is rocks in the territorial prison, because the evidence against you is going to put you away for the rest of your natural life." While Sheriff Morrison began the process of transferring Clara from defendant to witness in the case that would finally bring justice to the valley. As the cell door swung open and Clara stepped into freedom, the silver locket seemed to catch fire against her chest, its warmth spreading through her entire body as Jack's strong arms enfolded her in an embrace that spoke of relief, love, and promises for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. "I told you love always finds a way home," Clara whispered against Jack's chest, feeling his heart beating steady and strong beneath her cheek, while the silver locket pressed between them like a seal on a promise that had been written in their hearts from the moment she'd returned that first lost calf to his ranch. The afternoon sun, streaming through the jail's windows, painted everything golden as Jack lifted Clara's face to look into her eyes. His voice rough with emotion as he said, "Clara May Whitfield, you've saved every lost calf in this valley, but more than that, you've saved me from a life I didn't even know was empty until you filled it with purpose and love." 6 months later, the same valley that had once whispered accusations and suspicions now rang with wedding bells as Clara May Whitfield became Mrs. Jack Henderson in a ceremony attended by every rancher whose cattle she'd faithfully returned, their voices joining in celebration of a love story that had begun with lost calves and blossomed into something that would be told around campfires for generations to come. The silver locket that had carried her parents' memory through all her trials now rested against her heart as she stood beside Jack beneath an arch of wildflowers, his storm blue eyes reflecting the same wonder and gratitude that had marked their first meeting, while the valley spread before them like a promise of all the tomorrows they would share. "Dearly beloved," the circuit preacher began, but his words were nearly drowned out by the lowing of cattle from the corrals, including the 38 calves whose return had sparked the greatest love story the territory had ever witnessed, each animal now thriving under Jack's careful stewardship and Clara's gentle touch. As they exchanged vows written in hearts that had recognized each other from that first moment of connection, Clara felt the silver locket pulse with warmth that seemed to carry her parents' blessing from beyond the grave, while Jack's voice trembled with emotion as he promised to love, honor, and cherish the woman whose gift had saved not just his livestock, but his very soul. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by a crowd that included former skeptics, grateful neighbors, and even Sheriff Morrison, who'd become something of a local hero for exposing Barrow's corruption and ensuring that justice prevailed over money and influence. While from the territorial prison, Nathaniel Barrow could only dream of the empire he'd lost through greed and cruelty. As the celebration moved to the ranch house that was now truly their home, Clara found herself surrounded by the children of neighboring families, their faces bright with curiosity as they asked about her magical ability to find lost animals, and she knelt among them with the silver locket catching afternoon sunlight while she shared the wisdom her mother had taught her. "The secret isn't magic," Clara explained, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd learned that the greatest gifts often come disguised as ordinary talents. "It's simply caring enough to look, listening carefully enough to hear, and loving deeply enough to never give up on bringing families back together, whether they have 4 legs or 2. Jack watched from across the yard as his bride shared her gift with the next generation, his heart swelling with pride and love for the woman who'd taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in cattle or land, but in the connections that bind hearts together across any distance or difficulty. As sunset painted the mountains purple and gold, Clara and Jack stood together on their porch, watching the last of their wedding guests disappear down the valley road, while their cattle, including every calf she'd ever returned, grazed peacefully in fields that stretched to the horizon like a testament to love's power to heal and restore. "Clara May Henderson," Jack said, wrapping his arms around his wife while the silver locket caught the last rays of sunlight. "You returned every lost calf in the valley, but the most important thing you brought home was hope. Hope that broken things can be mended, lost things can be found, and 2 hearts can become one family when they're willing to fight for what matters most." The stars emerged one by one above their valley as Clara leaned back against Jack's chest, the silver locket warm against her heart, while she whispered a prayer of gratitude for parents who'd taught her to see finding lost things as a blessing, for a gift that had led her to the love of her life, and for a husband who'd counted 38 calves and chosen her too, proving that sometimes the most precious things we find are the ones we weren't even looking for. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. She brought back every calf. Would you have seen her as worthy too? Tell us in the comments.